So let's talk Scotland. Before I took a dive off the deep end into the gem trade, I spent 2 summers in Scotland. I wanted to write a book about the historical and literary realms of the magician, prophet, wizard Merlin from the Arthurian stories. A little bit of a research tour, but more like a spiritual pilgrimage. And I couldn't help but revisit some of those sacred sites that I once knew so well and spent so much of that year thinking about and looking for and exploring. So I'm here in Longtown. I'm actually in England right now. We're right on the border of England and Scotland, and we are behind Arthurian Church. So Arthurian is likely, possibly, the name of this place back in the Dark Ages times, Ardareth in the dialect of the day. And Ardareth is remembered as the place of a great battle. It's not a legendary battle, it's a historical battle, there's records of it, but there's also stories from the Merlin legends, the Merlin poetry, the Welsh tales about Merlin's presence in this battle. And so I'm here behind this old church because there is a little bit of a sacred site here, not necessarily directly related to the Merlin story, but to the paganism of the time. There's an ancient sacred well, a spring, and that's basically why this church is here. You know, all of the churches that came in were built around sacred sites of antiquity, and so a sacred spring to a pre-Christian pagan was a important and special place. And so building a sacred church on top of a sacred well or next to a sacred well is sort of normal behavior back then. So I wanted to stop here and just give a little context for this adventure, and then we're gonna go up the road a little bit and visit a Dark Ages Motte and Bailey, which is where the Battle of Ardareth happened and where Merlin went mad. I think we would agree that this is no longer a drinkable spring, but just to consider that, you know, in the early days, in those pagan Dark Ages, the primal forces of nature were one of the potential expressions of the divine to be worshipped. And so something like a spring could be considered to be a sacred place, as would have been a forest, a mountain, you know, simple outdoor expressions of the divine, of nature, of life itself. It's kind of powerful. And so every time I come, I always like to just touch the water a little bit. I like to anoint my jewelry because, of course, I like to think about the magical essences of the elements, you know, whatever that may mean to you or to me or to people of thousands of years ago. But if there is a sacredness to this place, and if it is possible to take a little bit of that sacredness with you, then I think anointing one's jewelry would be an appropriate way to go about it. In the 1880s, a historian named William Forbes Skene came up here from some other part of England, and he is the one who connects the Battle of Ardareth to Arthurian, where we just were down the road. And so in 1880 or so, he writes about coming to the Graham Arms and staying here, and then going out on his research expedition to look at the battle site, or what he connected to the battle site, and talk to some of the locals and ask them about, you know, their sort of verbal oral history of the region, and see if they knew anything about this battle. And sure enough, they did. Everything across the river is Scotland, and everything on this side is England. The first time I ever came here to this Iron Age fort was 2015, and as far as I know, this trail did not exist. I had to climb over 3 gates and a fence and walk through farmers' fields in order to get to the battle site of Merlin's madness. I'm quite excited to see this. This did not exist any of the times that I was ever here. This has nothing to do with me, but it felt like in some weird esoteric way that I was involved, because as I spent a year traveling around and visiting literally every one of these places that I had found from my own research, someone else was having the idea to set it up as a nationally known public experience. And so the year after I came and did my pilgrimage to the Merlin sites, the Merlin Trail was born. So this is the type of fort that might possibly have been here in the 6th century. Little Strength, otherwise known as Cair Gwendolew, or Gwendole's Fort. So I've made it to the edge of the outer ring. Here we can see this divot, basically like a moat in a time before moats. So the Motte and Bailey, it has different rings. So as an attacker wanted to come up the fort, they'd have to come down here, and then if they wanted to attack, they're attacking up, which is at an extreme disadvantage, first of all, because it's hard to get up here. It's quite steep, and there's people above you that are trying to kill you. Now, this is a great site for a fort because we can see that the water right down there, so nobody can attack from the back because water comes right up the cliff, so there's really no way to get up from that side. So they don't have to worry about protection from the back side, only from the front side. And going up the front side means going up one of these areas where there's arrows or spears or whatever coming down at you. It's muddy, it's very steep, it's not easy. If this fence wasn't here, I would definitely be on my hands trying to get up this steep thing. And now we're in the inner ring, so if my enemy's down there, throw a spear at him, no problem. And then up here, it's very foresty and overgrown, but at one time would have been flat with a small fort, some kind of a settlement, something to be defended. Now I've made it to the very top, and we can see the view is incredible. And it's very small up here. Maybe this was the site of possibly a tower, or who knows what it was like. Here we had a very clear view of the farm, the field, which was at that time in 573 a battle site. It's very difficult to try to imagine what this could have been like as a fort, as a battle, with an army trying to invade. And Merlin, the bard, druid, counselor of the chief here, would have been in battle So to try to help us imagine this, I've brought with me a poem, a modern poem, that gives us a little bit of an idea about what happened on that day. What he saw drove him mad. Was it her eye? Blue as water is blue under blue sky? Configurations of cloud, dispersing and massing in forms. His eyes ruin to ruin. What he had read of lust, treachery, greed, the chronicles of the human heart, he was not exempt. Or was it the drip of what is perceived as it loses magnificence, light of its own being, and trickles away into knowledge or explanations? In the idiom of the day, he looked in the sky and saw monsters. All around him, the clamor of fighting. He remembered the language of birds, leaves, running water, the pristine intensity of the image. He absorbed himself into the wood. And this is where the battle took place, right at the base of the fort. So we're in Moffat now. Just wanted to show a little bit of the downtown because I really love the way that they do the brickwork around here. How great does that look? The gray with the red accent, the local stone. So coming to the Moffat Museum, it seems that they now have a Merlin Trail exhibition, which walks you through the history of the region back from 550 AD, talking about the battle of the fort that we were just at, and the lifestyle of the people, and what was going on at the time between the battles, the religious beliefs, the relationship with nature, and then the incoming Christianity, which forms the central sort of pivot of the cultural battle that was going on at the time between the incoming Celtic Christianity and the old school belief system. And just giving us a little glimpse into what life might have been like in the time of Merlin with the battle. And the way that they've really framed it lately in the last decade or so is Merlin versus Mungo, Christianity versus paganism. Very cool exhibit. I wasn't expecting to see this. I'm very happy that it's here. So here we are, ground zero of the Merlin legend. So previously we were at Cair Gwendolo, the fort, where Merlin had his last battle. And in the wreckage and the carnage and the murder and the blood, he lost his mind. Stress, madness drove him into the forest, the Caledonian forest that would have once covered this entire area. He spends years evading civilization, living in the wild like an animal, unable to deal with the things that he's seen, the death of his nephew, the death of his chief, the death of his friends, and some of it by his own hands in the battle. So he lives in the wild like an animal. In his madness, he understands things that normal humans don't understand. In the period of time that he lived out here in the forest, which has now become empty hills, he started to understand things about the cycles of the seasons, about the ways of animals and plants, and possibly a bit about the underlying nature of reality and the universe. People catch glimpses of him, but they don't find him. They don't get him. Occasionally, someone is able to reel him back into society, and then immediately he escapes. He doesn't want to be part of the human world anymore in his wild madness. And over time, he does actually encounter other bards, other poets, Taliesin, and they're having a discourse about the seasons and the stars and the sun and the moon when they hear the word that a healing spring has suddenly started to bubble up from the ground. And so they go to see this miracle of nature, clean, fresh water. And it's not just any water. It's a special water that brings wisdom. And in the case of someone like Merlin, who's suffering from his post-traumatic stress, his inability to live in society, it does something special. He takes a drink from the spring, and suddenly his mind clears. He's human again. His mind functions like a human again. But he hasn't forgotten all of the things that he knew when he was living as a wild man of the woods. The turning of the seasons, the movement of animals, the way that the weather works, the fundamental mysteries of the universe. And so he starts to teach. He starts to prophesy. He was actually already prophesying the whole time. That was part of his madness. He could see things that were happening far away, and he could see things that hadn't yet happened. And he continued to do this. Meanwhile, teaching from a building that his sister constructed for him with 70 doors and 70 windows. First he taught Taliesin, then he taught another madness-stricken comrade who also received healing from the spring. And finally he teaches his sister, who eventually takes over as prophetess and continues the great work. Now, what does this have to do with this place, Heartfell, as it's called today? Well, notice, you can hear it, I'm sure, on this video. I'm coming along a path of water. And it's not just any old water, but a sacred spring. We can see the trickle of it as it moves down, down, down from the top of the mountain. A mile or two. And as we go, we have to consider how to keep our boots dry. Usually a jump is the best way. This as Nikolai Tolstoy has told us in his 1984 book, is the source of the healing spring. So this river that I am ascending up to the top of this mountain is that very water that gave Merlin his sanity back, that allowed him to return to humanity, that later, in Victorian times, brought hundreds or even thousands of people to this area, Moffat, the spa town with the healing waters. Nothing to do with the Merlin story, but a great coincidence because they're both the story of water, sacred water. And to sweeten the deal, as it were, we also have an important element in the Merlin story, the stag, an animal referenced several times. And if we look, what do we see but a herd of stag? So we ascend the hill and we'll continue our story in about a mile when I get to the source of the spring. If you look at the lore and the legends and the myths of the Merlin story today, you can decide to pin Merlin anywhere. He can be from Wales, which has some validity. He could be from England, which doesn't make as much sense, but there are Merlin's caves all over this island. But I had a feeling that there was going to be something to this heartfelt spa, and I have to say that it did not disappoint. As you can see, the terrain is just absolutely incredible. Very easy to understand what solitude would be like out here, so far away from society. Even if we're no longer in the Caledonian forest, we're still in some place that feels a bit epic. If you told me that some of the scenes from Lord of the Rings were inspired from this place, I wouldn't be surprised in the least, because the grandeur is on that level. It's a wild place. It was wild then, and it's still wild today. And we're getting closer. We're headed towards that little crevice between these two hills. That's our destination. The last time I was here, 6 years ago, there were no trees here. I am completely in love with the idea of regrowing the Caledonian forest. Forest that was cleared for farming, for sheep grazing, which is no longer necessary in this area. And so they replant and they bring back what once was. The sound has changed. The color of the water has changed. The rocks have changed. The feeling of this place Even though we're in the middle of the outdoors, everything feels close. The walls are hugging us tight now, and we can feel possibly that we have come into a sacred place. If not sacred for the magic in the water, then at least sacred in the tradition of coming here for pilgrimage. The cave. Is it Merlin's cave? No, it's not that old. But is it Merlin's spring? Possibly. We spoke before about the sacredness of water, of springs, the proximity to purity of nature, and the potential magic that resides within. Not only anointing the magic rings this time, but this time we anoint the body as well. It's a chalybeate spring, which is why all the water around here looks red. It has iron in it. And the iron and the microbes and whatever else was in that hole, that's part of the magic. Water with a hint of blood, the blood red iron of Mother Earth. So if you've ever seen Nikolai Tolstoy's book about the mysteries of Merlin, the back cover is exactly this shot. The last time I was here with Nikolai Tolstoy through some strange series of amazing events. And so I got him to sit somewhere right over here, and I took the exact same photo that's on the back of his book, except for it was 35 years later, and suddenly he was in the photo. So according to the legend, this is where Merlin came and drank from the chalybeate spring, and whether it was the microbes or the magic, he regained his sanity and continued on his journey, watching the mysteries of life unfold. And now we descend from a sacred mountaintop back into reality. And here we are back where we started. Always a pleasure to climb up, but always a little sad to have to go home.